Welcome everyone. My name is Yi and I'm the host for Occupational Medicine Pearls podcast. Today we will be reviewing an important chemical hazard, mercury. It is a classic but still very real risk to many workers handling this chemical. Mercury exposure is uncommon in modern regulated workplaces, but when it occurs, it's often subtle, chronic, and clinically deceptive. So let's go over what this chemical is about and what we should know about that. So what is mercury? Mercury exists in several biologically distinct forms, and the clinical picture depends heavily on which one you are dealing with. The most important thing is elemental mercury, or chemical name Hg0. It is a liquid at room temperature, can easily vaporize, and the main source of occupational inhalational exposure. There are also inorganic mercury salts. They can be monovalent, called mercurous salt, Hg1, or divalent, mercuric salt, Hg2. We also found organic mercury compounds, typically as methyl mercury, and it is found in seafood. Australia is a signatory of the Minamata Convention, so the use, import, and export of mercury are restricted. But legacy equipment, laboratory processes, and certain industries still pose exposure risk. The workplace exposure standard is extremely low, 0.003 ppm or 0.025 mg per cubic meter as 8 hours TWA. That tells us how potent this chemical is. We need to look at the exposure pathways now. So who is at risk? Mercury is used in batteries, thermometers, barometers, thermostats, floodlights, streetlights as a catalyst in the manufacturing, and it is also used to extract gold and silver ores. Most occupational exposure to mercury occur through inhalation of elemental mercury vapor. I was visiting a tea shop in the hills yesterday and I found a mercury thermometer, and they're still inside in there, so it is among us. Occupationally, we need to look at the manufacturing of amalgams, and that will include tin or amalgam of gold, copper, and zinc used in dentistry for filling teeth, amalgamated zinc used in electronic batteries, and sodium amalgam used in the laboratory in conjunction with water as a reducing agent. So anything to do with amalgams, we need to consider about mercury. And there are more dental work involving mercury, pigment and anti-fouling paint productions, gold and silver extraction as previously stated, laboratory work in enclosed spaces, or rarely fungicidal use in the process of exploration and processing natural gas, and finally handling of the fluorescent lamps and electrical meters, especially the legacy ones. From non-occupational perspective, we think about seafood, as it can contain methyl mercury. Skin lightening creams, especially if it is bought overseas, despite they may claim that there is no mercury or any other chemicals. If a worker had a recent fitting or removal of an amalgam, or recent intake of penicillin-type antibiotics, that can add the mercury to the worker. Therefore, we need to know about these exposures as they can confound our interpretation of biological monitoring. As usual, we will need to think about baseline assessments before letting someone work in the mercury risk work. It starts with baseline assessment, which covers classically explanation and education about the risks involved. With history, we will focus on if the worker has any current symptoms or conditions that could be exacerbated by exposure with mercury. And we need to go over past medical history, past employment history, medications, etc. System-wise, we need to consider any problem or history of neurological symptoms, psychological, renal, gastrointestinal, and skin-related symptoms. The same symptoms should be covered thoroughly in the physical examination. We will listen to chest, check the abdomen, does the whole body neurological balance, coordination examination. There should be good documentation of the psychological stability and profile. In terms of bedside tests, We can consider urine dipstick as an easy go-to test, but spirometry may not be needed unless the history suggests otherwise. Mercury itself is not going to trigger asthma, but it can be really irritant, so that may trigger pre-existing asthma in the susceptible workers. As a biological baseline, we collect spot urine sample, and that will show the level of inorganic mercury. In terms of the level, it is regarded as 20 micromole per mole creatinine. It is the level where we need to do something about the worker's exposure. It is equivalent to 35 microgram per gram creatinine or 35 microgram per liter. For someone with non-occupational background level, we would expect that below 1 microgram per gram creatinine. After this, we look at ongoing exposure monitoring or health surveillance. Under work health and safety regulations, the health monitoring applies to elemental mercury and mercurous salt, not mercurous salt or organic mercury. From exposure pathways, we need to look at mostly inhalation as a primary and also at the dermal absorption. From our body, it is excreted through urine, feces, or the perspiration, sweat, and saliva. Mercury has a long half-life, and it can take approximately about 60 days. That's only half-life. So when we are collecting sample, it should be done before the start of the shift to avoid any external contamination. And because of the longer half-life, we should be doing 6-monthly testing. We can also arrange blood level of mercury, and the action level is 15 microgram per liter. Please note that blood total mercury is inclusive of both organic and inorganic forms. So if someone is eating a lot of seafood and adding mercury to their blood, it may be hard to interpret. In terms of fitness for work, if a worker has symptoms and if their urinary inorganic mercury level is more than 20 micromole per mole creatinine, we will need to remove them. And that also requires a plausible causal link to the workplace exposure. I'll repeat, the level is 20 micromole per mole creatinine. Once a worker is removed, monitoring should happen every 30 days until the level falls below 20 on 2 consecutive tests. And obviously, return to work also requires resolution of clinical symptoms if they are present. Now we will look at the health effects of mercury. Before we go on about that, it is worth remembering the most infamous example of mercury toxicity in human history. It is called Minamata disease. The disease was first identified in 1956 in Minamata, Japan, after decades of industrial discharge of methylmercury contaminated wastewater into Minamata Bay. The toxins bioaccumulated in fish and shellfish, leading to widespread poisoning in the local community and even animals, and famously described as having dancing cats syndrome. Thousands were affected, and the disaster became a defining moment in environmental health, ultimately contributing to global mercury control, such as the Minamata Convention, which Australia is part of the signature. From occupational health context, the acute exposure can happen when a worker exposed to higher concentration of mercury vapor, and that can cause widespread symptoms. It starts with the respiratory tract irritation, pneumonitis, metal fume fever, or pulmonary fibrosis. We need to think about skin, so corrosive blisters, and contact dermatitis. And potentially, it is an autotoxin as well. From central nervous system, it can cause irritability, tremor, memory issues, and peripheral neuropathy. With a high enough dose, it can cause renal tubular necrosis and causing stomatitis, excessive salivation, and gastroenteritis in the gastrointestinal tract. If we are looking at the chronic effects, it can start with dermatitis and skin sensitization, renal toxicity, and neurobehavioral changes, such as change with attention, memory impairment, and slow psychomotor function. With the GI, it can cause chronic diarrhea as well. Historically, there is a term called mercurial erythism. It is a psychological syndrome historically seen in the hat makers. And its features include abnormal shyness, irritability, emotional instability, anxiety, hypochondrial fears, and depression. Tremors is often the earliest and most recognizable sign. It starts subtly from fingers and fine motor tasks and progress to lips, tongue, eyes, lower lips. Stress, fatigue, and alcohol make that worse. And in advanced cases, ongoing exposure can lead to hallucination, psychosis, and cognitive decline. So there is nothing good about that. If you look at the symptoms of elemental mercury exposure, it can be very similar to the Minamata disease symptom. The key is that with the Minamata disease, there is a toxic level of methylmercury which crosses the blood-brain barrier and attacks the nervous tissue right away. So they are more prone to cause central nervous system symptoms and also to the developing babies, whereas the elemental mercury are most likely to cause harm in acute state to the lungs and the kidneys along the way. But practically speaking, if either form of mercury is exposed for high enough dose, the symptoms can be very similar. So if I have to summarize that, long-term exposure of mercury can cause psychoneurological symptoms, and that can impact almost every function of the brain. It can also impact skin, gastrointestinal tract. So that is mostly through the occupational exposure. That's all for today. The key takeaway message is that if you don't think of mercury, you won't diagnose any mercury poisoning because the symptoms are non-specific and the exposure pathways are subtle and biological monitoring thresholds are low. The symptoms can overlap with other causes where the person might be experiencing from. So if we know the symptoms and if we can detect the symptoms earlier through health surveillance, you can prevent long-term neurological damage. Thank you for listening. That's it for today's episode of Occupational Medicine Pearls podcast. If you found this useful, please share it with a colleague, especially anyone involved in health monitoring or workplace assessments. I'm Yi, and see you next time.